Cris Cyborg Justino is undeniably one of the most badass female fighters of all time. She's the only MMA fighter in history to have won the Grand Slam. The undisputed queen of the ring remained undefeated for 13 years and holds world championship titles in 4 major MMA promotions. Let's dive into our top picks of the Brazilian juggernaut's most memorable times in the ring. Starting off with a bad start and some lessons learned. She may have reigned the ring for more than a decade, and she's considered one of the most fearsome figures in MMA, but not many know that things weren't always as great for Cyborg. Well, her professional MMA career started with a defeat, but we think it still held a lot of lessons for the young fighter on her way to greatness. The then 19-year-old faced Erica Paes at Show Fight 2 in 2005, where she was taken down pretty early but still managed to get back up. She looked promising from the beginning, knew her opponent well, and looked to throw punches and grapple at the perfect time. But since Paes was more experienced, she caught Cyborg in a double knee bar as she attempted to land strikes left, right, and center, unstoppable from the very beginning. And it was due to this unconventional submission that Cris was forced to tap at the 146 mark of the first round. But despite being written off by a few, many saw her as a super impressive budding talent. Next up, Cyborg makes a North American debut. Before Cris arrived in North America to fight Shayna Baszler in 2008, only die-hard MMA fans knew who she was, and the bookies had already labeled her as a huge underdog. Her opponent Baszler had a history of pushing her opponents to submit, and most fans predicted the same at Elite XC, Unfinished Business, where more than 2.6 million viewers turned to watch the event live on CBS. Shayna, who had way more experience than Cris, began the fight attempting to lock her in a submission hold, but Cyborg had learned a thing or two by then and was able to fend off her opponent without being caught. The first action was all defense, but then came the second round, which packed a lot more action, with Cris attacking Shayna and pushing her to the ground. In fact, the Brazilian landed a burst of strikes that opened up Baszler, leading Cris to believe she'd won due to her injury. She jumped up on the cage to celebrate, unaware that the fight had not yet been stopped by the officials. But it didn't take long for her to finish off Baszler anyway, as she continued to ruthlessly land a barrage of punches up against the fence, causing the official to finally stop the fight. Ah, the sweet, sweet joy of proving your critics wrong. Not to forget the super thrilling Cyborg versus Gina. In 2009, the legendary fighter faced Gina Carano in the main event of a Strikeforce card. Unfortunately, the crowd here booed and discouraged Cris when Jimmy Lennon Jr. introduced the fighters. Meanwhile, Carano received a standing ovation from the nearly 14,000 fans inside the HP Pavilion in San Jose, California. But she was used to it, and the queen of the ring knew how to shut her critics right up. The Brazilian started the fight by pushing the American against the cage and attempting a clumsy throw. The fight soon reached the ground, which is when Cyborg attempted a leg lock, but the two returned to their feet after failing to secure the hold. She fumbled another throw and landed on her back, giving Carano a mount, who then stood up and let Cris get to her feet after a few seconds of ground and pound. This proved to be a huge mistake, because it didn't take very long for the Brazilian to take over after that. She unloaded her ground strikes after an aborted submission attempt, bringing the fight to an end at the 4:59 mark of the first round. The victory gave her the inaugural Strikeforce Women's Featherweight title, and Carano never fought again after this humiliating defeat. And she did the same to Ibragimova. Daria was high on a 7-fight winning streak when she went into her matchup with Cyborg, and she hasn't fought again either. To her credit though, the Russian fought smartly and successfully throughout the entire bout, spending the first half of the time pinning Cris against the cage and attempting takedowns. In fact, several times during the round, she would briefly knock her to the ground successfully, but each time, Cyborg, being the iconic fighter she is, got back up and with only a few seconds left in the round, would calmly approach Ibragimova and deliver a powerful straight right punch that knocked the opponent out. Just a few more ground attacks sealed the deal for the Brazilian. Up next, Cris Ruthless Strikes versus Finney. Now, many of you may have noticed how Cyborg's style has evolved over time. In all her old fights, we saw that she used to be a brawler who struck with powerful punches and zero mercy. But with time, she's become more selective in her attacks. We, for one, miss the fiery fighter that she once was. If you haven't seen the old Cris in action, you seriously need to watch her Strikeforce title defense against Jan Finney in June 2010. She defeated Finney in almost every position in that matchup, in the open, against the cage, and on the ground. Absolutely ruthless, like a true cyborg that she was. When the final strike count was tallied, the iconic fighter had 127 total strikes to Finney's measly 29. Next up, her UFC debut. Cris finally made her UFC debut in 2016 after years of hemming and hawing against seasoned MMA fighter Leslie Smith in her home country, Brazil. While she'd already made quite a name for herself, many in the industry predicted that she'd never enter the UFC thanks to her strained relations with owner Dana White. But she still went on to join the promotion and made an immediate impact in her very first fight. She had to fight at the 140-pound weight class rather than her preferred 145-pound weight class, which surprisingly Cris showed little concern about and fought Smith head-on. The eagerly anticipated match began rather slowly. Cyborg initially worked at a distance for the first minute, but this feisty Brazilian wasn't used to the slow pace, so she decided to turn up the heat. She dropped Smith with a flurry of attacks on her opponent's body and head. The end came quickly after that, thanks to several hammer fists on the ground. After many right and left hooks on Smith, at barely 1.5 minutes into the round, the official stopped the fight and declared Cyborg the winner in her UFC debut. The fight ended with her landing 30 strikes and Smith landing just 3. What followed next was her jumping to the top of the cage to soak in the Brazilian fans' loud cheers and enjoy her well-deserved victory. And how can we forget the glorious 20th consecutive win? There's been some outstanding undefeated streaks in MMA history, but Cris's 20th consecutive victory cemented her place as one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. She's had some super amazing fights during her winning streak, but we think the number 20th against Yana Kunitskaya stands out the most. Even though this fight only lasted one round, there were early back-and-forth exchanges that made Cyborg fight through some tricky situations. Yana put up a great fight but was eventually knocked out by TKO after she was rendered defenseless and dazed by a barrage of punches late in the first round. Next up, Cris Cyborg wins the UFC title. This one's gotta be everyone's favorite. We bet even Cris's. The opportunity to challenge Tonya Evinger for the UFC title came after a long and challenging journey at UFC 214. But neither fighter entered the bout wearing the UFC featherweight title belt, since this fight wasn't really between a champion and a challenger. In fact, the former title holder, Germaine de Randamie, was stripped of it after declining to challenge Cyborg for it. So this led to her and Evinger engaging in a bout to win the vacant title. Tonya was great, but like Cris's previous 18 opponents, she couldn't stand a chance against the formidable striker. At just 156 into the third round, Cyborg delivered a knee to Evinger's head against the fence, bringing the fight to an end, earning her featherweight title belt amid the loud, joyous cheers of the crowd. And last but not least, winning the MMA Grand Slam. Other than being the UFC champion, Cris also held championship titles in 3 other significant MMA leagues, including the Grand Slam that she won so effortlessly. It was the 4th round of her Bellator MMA debut in California when Cyborg punched the daylights out of former featherweight champion Julia Budd. She was repeatedly struck in the face and body during the opening rounds of the bout as the ruthless Brazilian showed little mercy to her opponent in a classic Cyborg fashion. She then celebrated the victory in utter disbelief after ending Budd's 2,998-day winning streak when she finally won in the 4th round after constantly torturing Budd from a standing position throughout round 4. Her victory had the MMA in awe. Fans were ecstatic, her critics finally sang her praises, and even the former 2-weight UFC champion McGregor called it incredible in his Twitter post. She's the only MMA fighter, male or female, to win the Grand Slam title in history. The Brazilian is the reigning Bellator women's featherweight champion and has defended the title 4 times. Before competing in the UFC, she also won championships in Invictus and Strikeforce, giving her titles in 4 different MMA leagues. And that's a wrap for this video. See you in the next one.